The billionaire CEO almost walked past her, a little girl, no older than 8, sleeping on a pile of garbage behind his office building. Her only blanket a thin, tattered jacket, but what stopped him wasn't the sight of her curled up in the cold. It was the skinny stray dog pressed against her side, guarding her like a soldier who had never been given the order to stand down. And when the CEO crouched down and looked closer, his blood ran cold, because this little girl wasn't homeless. She was hiding. The city never truly sleeps, but it does get quieter after midnight. The restaurants closed, the office lights dark, the streets of downtown Chicago emptied out until all that's left is the hum of street lamps and the distant echo of passing taxis. And that was the world Marcus Reed was moving through when his black Mercedes crawled through the back alley behind his building, the same route he always took to avoid the paparazzi who'd been camping outside ever since Revive Labs went public, his eyes burning from 14 hours of spreadsheets and pitch decks and people who wanted something from him. When the headlights caught something, a flash of color, something small, something that didn't belong, and he leaned forward over the steering wheel and saw her, a little girl, no older than 7, tucked between two overflowing dumpsters beneath a flattened cardboard box, her knees pulled to her chest, her small arms wrapped around a golden brown dog pressed against her like a living blanket. The dog's one open eye fixed on the headlights without barking, without moving, ears flat, as if it had learned long ago that making noise was dangerous. The girl's dark hair tangled, her pink unicorn jacket to sizes too small and ripped at the elbow, her once white sneakers now gray with peeling soles, and around her wrist a thin red bracelet made of plastic beads and string. She looked asleep. But the moment Marcus stepped out of the car and the door clicked shut, the dog's tail gave one slow wag and the girl's fingers quietly tightened around his fur. Because she wasn't asleep at all, she was terrified. So Marcus stopped where he was, crouched down to her level, and kept his voice as soft as he possibly could, saying he wasn't going to hurt her. And after a silence, the dog sniffed toward him and wagged again. And Marcus asked if that was her dog, and the tiniest voice imaginable said his name is Biscuit. And something shifted in Marcus's chest. He hadn't heard a child's voice like that in so long. Not unguarded, not genuine. Not since his own daughter Lily had stopped speaking to him in full sentences, after her mother moved them both to Seattle, leaving him with weekend calls that felt like job interviews and a birthday card. That came back and opened, but he pushed that away and stayed present. Told her Biscuit looked like he'd been taking good care of her. Watched her finally open her enormous dark brown eyes and search his face for a threat. Heard her say we're okay. We don't need help even though her lips were chapped and her hands were shaking. Learned her name was Rosie. Learned she'd been out there a while. And looked around at the alley. No bag. No food, no adult anywhere, just a child, a dog. And a city that had kept moving without noticing either of them. And made a decision. Telling her he had a warm car and granola bars. And that Biscuit could sit between them the whole time, and if she felt even a little scared, he'd drive her anywhere she wanted. And Rosie looked at Biscuit, and Biscuit wagged his tail. And she looked back and said okay. But Biscuit gets his own granola bar. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Marcus Reed smiled. And meant it. The world knew Marcus Reed as the man who had turned a dorm room idea into $1 billion healthcare technology company by the time he was 34. Forbes had called him ruthlessly brilliant. Bloomberg had called him the most emotionally unavailable genius in Silicon Valley. His employees respected him and feared him in equal measure. He was decisive, he was efficient, and he did not under any circumstances let things get personal. But that was the version of Marcus that showed up every morning at 7 a.m. in a tailored suit. Because the real version, the one sitting in a parked car at 2:30 a.m. handing granola bars to a 7-year-old and her dog, was a man who hadn't cooked a meal for himself in 3 years, who still kept a drawing his daughter made of their family on his office desk, even though the family no longer existed, who sometimes drove around the city late at night just because his penthouse was too quiet, a man who had built walls and was proud of those walls, because they'd made him successful, and kept him focused and protected him from the kind of mess that feelings created. But as Rosie sat in the passenger seat with Biscuit across her lap eating her second granola bar and Marcus sat beside her drinking cold coffee from a travel mug, those walls were doing very poor work. And when he gently suggested she call someone, family, someone who might be looking for her, Rosie's chewing slowed and she said after a pause that her grandma didn't have a phone anymore. And she lived at the Millfield Apartments on Archer, and Marcus knew Archer Avenue. Knew Millfield Apartments too, a crumbling complex on the south side that his company's urban development subsidiary had flagged 2 years ago in a city renewal proposal, a proposal he had approved without ever visiting the location in person. And when he carefully asked about her mom or dad, The granola bar wrapper crinkled in Rosie's fingers, and she said her mom had been in the hospital for a really long time. And Marcus set down his coffee and asked about her dad. And Rosie looked out the window at the dark street and said simply, "I don't have one of those." And the way she said it, not with sadness, not with anger, just with the flat matter-of-fact certainty of a child who had long ago accepted a truth that no child should ever have to accept, hit Marcus somewhere behind the ribs. And he said quietly, "Okay, we're going to find your grandma." It was nearly 4 a.m. by the time Marcus found the right apartment, and the building was worse in person than it had ever been in the proposal documents. 2 floors cordoned off with yellow tape, half the hallway lights broken, an elevator with an out-of-order sign that looked like it had been there since 2019. And when an elderly woman opened the door on the 3rd floor in a housecoat and glasses, and saw Rosie standing there, she let out a sound Marcus had never heard from a human being before. Something between a sob and a gasp and a prayer all at once, pulling the girl into her arms so hard that Biscuit jumped up and tried to join the hug. And her name was Dorothy. She was 71, moved with a cane, and had been searching the streets on foot since midnight without a phone, because she couldn't afford one, knocking on every neighbor's door asking to borrow one to call for help. But this was not the kind of building where neighbors opened their doors at midnight. And so Marcus sat in her small living room, clean despite everything, framed family photos on every surface, a hand-stitched blanket on the couch, and drank the tea she insisted on making him, while Rosie fell asleep in 7 minutes flat in the back room with Biscuit curled beside her. Door half opened so Dorothy could hear her breathing, and Dorothy explained quietly, holding her cup with both hands, that her daughter Angela had been in County General for months with kidney failure, on the transplant list but barely, because it cost money just to stay on that list. The fees, the tests, the follow-ups, and she had been selling things but there wasn't much left to sell. And before Angela went into the hospital, she had made Dorothy promise to keep Rosie in school, keep her safe, keep Biscuit with her, because that dog was the only thing that made Rosie feel like her mama was still close. And Dorothy set down her cup and said that tonight she had failed that promise, that the rent check had bounced and the building manager changed the locks at 6 o'clock, just like that. And she had called her neighbor who let them in, but the neighbor only had one room, and said the dog had to go. And Rosie had taken Biscuit and walked out before Dorothy could stop her, saying she wasn't going to let anyone take him, saying her mama would want him safe. And Marcus looked at the photo of Angela on the wall, a young woman laughing with her head thrown back and her eyes squeezed shut, completely unguarded, the way people laugh when they don't know they're being photographed. And he recognized something in that laugh without being able to name it, only knowing that it made his throat tighten. And then Dorothy asked him suddenly why he had stopped, because most people would have kept driving. And Marcus thought about it honestly and said he had a daughter, that she was 8, that he didn't see her enough. And Dorothy nodded slowly like that was the only answer she needed and said quietly that a child sleeping in the street is everybody's failure, not just one person's. And Marcus didn't argue. Marcus couldn't sleep. And so he went into his office at 6 a.m. still in yesterday's clothes and told his assistant to pull every document related to the Millfield Apartments renewal proposal. And what he found cracked something open inside him, because the proposal, his proposal, reviewed and signed by his own hand 18 months ago, had included a clause authorizing the sale of Millfield to a private developer, with a plan to demolish the building and replace it with a mixed-use luxury complex. The current tenants to be relocated with assistance of $500 per family, in a city where average monthly rent was $1,800, and he had signed it, had either not read that clause carefully or had read it and let it pass, because it was just numbers on a page, not people, not a 71-year-old woman walking the streets at midnight, not a 7-year-old girl and her dog sleeping on garbage. And when he dug further, he found that the developer who had bought the building, Crane Capital Group, was a firm in which Revive Labs held a 12% investment stake through a subsidiary, meaning Marcus had financially benefited indirectly from the displacement of Dorothy and her granddaughter. And he sat back in his chair and let that land. Because the city had a plan to help the people of Millfield. He was the plan. And the plan was $500 and a bulldozer. And then he pulled up County General's patient portal, where he served on the donor board, and searched for Angela Morris. And she was there, room for 112, critical, active transplant candidate, with a funding gap of $47,000 in outstanding medical cost. That had caused her case to be flagged for deprioritization. $47,000. Which was less than he had spent on catering for his last product launch. And he closed the laptop, and opened it again, and closed it again. And then he called his CFO. He didn't go to the press first. he went back to Dorothy's borrowed room. And she opened the door in the morning light with Rosie behind her dressed in fresh clothes that were too big. Borrowed probably, eating toast with biscuit at her feet. And when Rosie saw Marcus, she tilted her head and said, "You came back," as if that was the surprising part. And he said, "I came back," and sat down at the small kitchen table across from Dorothy and told her everything. The proposal, the clause, the investment stake, the medical bill, and he didn't soften it. Didn't use corporate language or legal framing, just told it the way it was. That he had made decisions that affected her family without thinking of her family as real. And that was wrong. And Dorothy listened in silence while Rosie listened too, quietly chewing her toast, her eyes moving between Marcus and her grandmother with an alertness that was too old for her face. And when Marcus finished, Dorothy didn't speak for a long moment, and then said, "Are you telling me this because you feel guilty, or because you're going to do something about it?" And Marcus said, "Both. And I think both matter." And he placed a folder on the table with 3 documents inside. First, a wire transfer confirmation for $47,000 to County General, covering Angela's outstanding cost and reactivating her transplant candidacy as of that morning. The second, a revised relocation proposal for Millfield, offering not $500 per family but a full 2-year housing subsidy and case-by-case assistance fund to be managed by a nonprofit his company would fund. The third, a personal letter to the board of Revive Labs recommending a full review of all community impact investment decisions going forward with mandatory on-site visits before approval. And he hadn't told his PR team anything because he wasn't doing it for publicity. He was doing it because Rosie was looking at him with those enormous brown eyes, and he needed to be the kind of person who deserved to be looked at that way. And Dorothy picked up the transfer confirmation and held it with both hands, the way someone holds something they're afraid to believe is real, and whispered, "My daughter, she's going to get her transplant." And Marcus told her she was back on the active list as of that morning, that he had spoken to the transplant coordinator at 7 a.m. And Dorothy made that sound again, the one from the night before. And this time Marcus recognized it. It was the sound of a prayer that had finally been answered. And then Rosie slipped off her chair, walked to Marcus, and without any warning or preamble climbed up and hugged him, arms around his neck, face against his shoulder, fierce and small and complete. And Marcus sat completely still for 3 seconds and then put his arms around her and held on. And Biscuit put his head on Marcus's knee, and no one said anything for a while. And the morning light came through the window, and it was enough. 6 months later, Angela Morris walked out of County General on a Tuesday afternoon in September. Then, moving carefully, gripping the railing on the way down the steps, but she walked. She walked out into the sunlight, and Rosie was waiting at the bottom of those steps. And when Angela saw her daughter, she sat right down on the steps and held her, and rocked her back and forth like she was still an infant, saying her name over and over, "Rosie, Rosie, Rosie," while Biscuit ran circles around them both, and Dorothy stood to the side, with her hand over her mouth, and let it happen. And Marcus was not there that day, hadn't been invited and hadn't asked to be, because that moment belonged to them and had nothing to do with him. But the week before, he had been in Seattle, had driven to a house with a yellow door and knocked on it. And when his daughter Lily opened it, she'd grown 3 inches, he noticed, and had her mother's skeptical eyebrows. She looked at him for a long moment and said, "You're late. You were supposed to come at 2. And he said, "I know. I'm sorry." And she said, "You're always sorry." And he said, "I know that too." And she held the door open and stepped back. Not a hug, not forgiveness, but an open door with room for him to walk through it. And he walked through it. And later that fall, a reporter from the Chicago Tribune ran a story about the Millfield Apartments revitalization, a local nonprofit managing the fund, dozens of families getting real relocation help, the demolition pause pending a full community impact review. And the reporter mentioned Revive Labs and its CEO in the 4th paragraph. Not the headline, and Marcus kept that article. Not the one about the IPO. Not the Forbes cover. This one, the 4th paragraph one. And he kept it next to the crayon drawing his daughter had made of their family, that he'd kept on his desk for 3 years, even when the family wasn't real anymore. Except now the drawing had a note attached to the bottom of it written in Lily's handwriting during his last visit that said, "Dad, I know you're trying. Biscuit is a dumb name for a dog. Love, Lily." And he didn't know how she'd heard about Biscuit, but he taped that note to the drawing and kept both of them on his desk. And every morning, when he sat down to make decisions that affected people he'd never met, he looked at them first, because decisions on paper have names, they have faces. They have little girls who protect their dogs because their mamas asked them to, and they deserve better than $500 and a bulldozer.